What would you do if the world ended not with a bang, but with silence, ash, and the ticking clock of fear? Cinema has asked that question for decades, and some films didn't just entertain, they left audiences shaken to the core. These aren't your average disaster flicks. They're warnings, nightmares, and sometimes eerily close to reality. Stay with me, because the list you're about to hear may haunt you long after the credits roll. On the Beach, 1959. Picture this. The world is already gone. No mushroom clouds, no chaotic sirens, no dramatic countdowns. Just silence and a slow drift toward the inevitable. That's what On the Beach delivers a haunting film that refuses cheap thrills and instead stares into the quiet despair of humanity's final days. Based on Neville Shute's chilling novel, this 1959 classic unfolds in Australia, one of the last places untouched, at least for the moment, after a global catastrophe. The genius of On the Beach lies in its restraint. Director Stanley Kramer doesn't bombard viewers with flashy effects. Instead, he shows sailors' families and ordinary people grappling with the knowledge that their time is limited. Gregory Peck. Ava Gardner and Fred Astaire deliver performances soaked in dignity and sorrow. There's a race car driver who pushes himself harder, lovers who cling to fragile moments, and officials struggling to maintain a semblance of order when they know the end is approaching. One of the film's most terrifying choices? Its pace. It doesn't sprint toward destruction, it walks you through it. We watch characters continue their routines, sip wine, fall in love, and argue all while the invisible cloud inches closer. That slowness is suffocating, because the audience is left to imagine what can't be seen. And imagination, as always, is the scariest tool in cinema. When it premiered, the movie was described as devastating and unforgettable. Critics and audiences alike were shaken by its refusal to sugarcoat reality. Instead of escapism, it gave viewers a mirror asking, what would you do if you knew the end was certain? For many, that question lingered far longer than the film itself. On the Beach remains one of the earliest and most unforgettable films to turn nuclear fear into art. Fail Safe, 1964. Now, let's turn the clock forward a few years to Fail Safe. Released in 1964, the same year as Stanley Kubrick's satirical masterpiece Dr. Strangelove. But where Strangelove plays the absurdity of human folly for laughs, Fail Safe strips away the humor and gives us pure, relentless tension. The setup is simple, but the effect is brutal. A technical malfunction sends American bombers rushing toward Moscow. There's no villain twirling a mustache here, just cold machinery, human error, and the terrifying possibility that a mistake can't be undone. Director Sidney Lumet frames the story almost like a courtroom drama. You're trapped in rooms full of men staring at clocks and phone lines, knowing that decisions made in seconds will change history forever. Henry Fonda plays the U.S. president with understated brilliance. His performance is calm, measured almost painfully human. He embodies the nightmare scenario of any leader having to choose between unthinkable options. One of the most chilling aspects is how emotionless the discussions become. Military strategists argue in numbers, probabilities, and protocols, as if human lives were just tallies on a chalkboard. Unlike more dramatic films, Fail Safe never cheats with music or melodrama. The silence between lines feels heavier than explosions. The stark black and white cinematography makes everything look cold, metallic, and merciless. And then comes the ending. No spoilers here, but let's just say it stunned audiences into silence. It's not about spectacle, it's about the gut punch of inevitability. When it was released, many people left theaters shaken, and some critics said it felt less like a movie and more like a prophecy. That's the secret power of Fail Safe. It isn't about what you see on screen, it's about what you feel in your chest when the credits roll. The sense that maybe we came close to living this story. Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, 1964. How do you laugh at the end of the world? Leave it to Stanley Kubrick. Dr. Strangelove landed in 1964 like a punchline with teeth-sharp absurd and uncomfortably real. At first glance, it's a comedy about the unthinkable. Generals lose their minds, politicians panic, and Peter Sellers plays not one, not two, but three unforgettable roles, including the bizarre wheelchair-bound Dr. Strangelove himself. But beneath the laughs, the movie hides a truth scarier than any monster. Human folly is often more dangerous than any missile. The story begins with a rogue general who decides to launch a strike against the Soviet Union. From there, the madness snowballs. The war room, complete with its giant circular table, is filled with characters shouting, arguing, and making decisions that could wipe out millions. The absurdity is the point. Kubrick is reminding us that it's not machines that fail, it's people with their egos, paranoia, and unchecked power. One of the film's greatest strengths is its tone. Unlike Fail-Safe, which went for suffocating seriousness, Dr. Strangelove uses satire to show just how ridiculous the idea of controlling destruction really is. Viewers laughed nervously in theaters, but many admitted the humor left them unsettled. The famous ending with Slim Pickens riding a bomb like a rodeo cowboy is one of the most iconic images in film history. Funny? Yes. Terrifying? Absolutely. Over the years, the movie has been praised as both a comedy and a cautionary tale. Politicians, historians, and critics still point to it as a work that captured the insanity of nuclear brinkmanship better than any speech could. Dr. Strangelove proves that sometimes the only way to expose the absurdity of power is to laugh at it until you realize the joke might be on all of us. The War Game, 1966. If On the Beach made you weep and Dr. Strangelove made you laugh nervously, The War Game made you stop breathing. Released in 1966, this pseudo-documentary by Peter Watkins was so raw and disturbing that the BBC refused to air it on television for decades. Why? Because it didn't just imagine nuclear devastation. It staged it complete with graphic details, newsreel-style commentary, and interviews that felt too real for comfort. Shot in stark black and white. The War Game looks like a television news report unraveling in real time. It begins with escalating tensions, then shows what happens when strikes hit the United Kingdom. The aftermath is almost unbearable to watch. Families scatter, chaos erupts, and the survivors face starvation, illness, and despair. Watkins didn't soften anything. His lens showed the breakdown of order, the collapse of health systems, and the brutal realities that polite society tries to ignore. What made the film especially terrifying was its style. It wasn't science fiction, it was journalism. It looked like it could air on the evening news at any moment. The interviews are haunting. Citizens speak in dazed tones, children cry without understanding why, and officials repeat lines of cold bureaucracy. The realism left audiences shaken because it blurred the line between fiction and reality. Despite being banned from British television at the time, The War Game went on to win the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature. That irony says it all. It was too real to broadcast, but too important to ignore. Even today, it's studied in film schools and shown in history classes as one of the most uncompromising depictions of nuclear horror ever made. Watching it is not entertainment, it's an experience, one that leaves viewers staring into silence, wondering how close the world once came. The Day After, 1983. Now, imagine an entire nation glued to their screens watching the end unfold in their living rooms. That was the reality of the day after a television event in 1983 that shocked the United States. More than 100 million people tuned in, making it one of the most watched TV films in history. And for good reason, it didn't hold back. Set in Lawrence, Kansas, the story follows ordinary people before, during, and after a nuclear strike. There's no heroic escape or hidden bunker here. Just families, farmers, doctors, and students watching their lives disintegrate in an instant. Director Nicholas Meyer built the tension, slowly letting viewers get attached to characters before ripping everything apart. The mushroom cloud scene became infamous, so raw and unsettling that it made children cry, parents panic, and even politicians take notice. What made The Day After so terrifying wasn't just its imagery, but its reach. This wasn't a niche art house film it aired during prime time. Families sat down expecting a movie and ended up with a nightmare that felt uncomfortably plausible. Some schools even canceled classes the next day because kids were too shaken. The White House reportedly screened it, and President Ronald Reagan admitted that the movie deeply disturbed him. Technically, the film was made for TV, but it carried the emotional punch of a theatrical release. It sparked national debates about defense safety and the future. Critics were divided. Some called it sensational. Others called it necessary, but no one walked away unaffected. The brilliance of The Day After was that it forced millions to ask themselves the same haunting question. What if this really happened tomorrow? Testament, 1983. If The Day After showed the shockwave, Testament showed the aftermath, and it hurt in ways few films dare. Released in 1983, this quiet, devastating drama wasn't about explosions or generals in war rooms. Instead, it focused on one suburban family trying to keep life stitched together after the unthinkable. The horror here wasn't spectacle. It was ordinary life, unraveling in slow motion. Jane Alexander plays the mother Carol in a performance so raw, it earned her an Academy Award nomination. The story begins with the family living a picture-perfect suburban routine, kids going to school, neighbors dropping by community picnics. Then, without warning, disaster strikes. Power goes out, communication breaks down, and the invisible danger creeps in. But instead of showing grand citywide destruction, Testament zooms in on tiny details: the empty dinner tables, the whispered bedtime stories, the desperate attempts to hold on to routine when everything familiar is slipping away. What terrified audiences wasn't what they saw, it was what they felt. Parents watching the movie began imagining their own children, their own homes stripped of safety. The film doesn't use special effects or dramatic music to twist the knife. It simply places viewers in a living room that could easily be their own, and then lets reality collapse piece by piece. Unlike many other films of its era, Testament is not about governments, armies, or strategy. It's about people, the ones left behind. That focus made it one of the most heartbreaking depictions of nuclear aftermath ever put to screen. By the time the credits rolled, audiences weren't just unsettled, they were emotionally exhausted. And that's why it remains one of the most unforgettable stories about how the end of the world would truly feel, not just look. Threads, 1984. If there's one film that still gives nightmares decades later, it's Threads. Made for British television. In 1984, this movie is often described as the most realistic and most horrifying depiction of nuclear war ever filmed. Forget the comfort of special effects or Hollywood gloss. Threads strips away any sense of distance and drops viewers directly into the chaos, leaving scars that don't fade easily. The story follows the city of Sheffield, beginning with everyday lives, students falling in love, families bickering, people shopping in markets. Then tensions escalate and suddenly everything changes. The strikes come. What follows is relentless. There are no noble sacrifices, no cinematic pauses, just brutal realism. The camera doesn't look away from melted buildings, desperate crowds, or the long, agonizing decline of society. What made Threads so terrifying wasn't just its graphic imagery, but its authenticity. The filmmakers consulted experts on what would actually happen: food shortages, disease, government collapse, and the unraveling of basic human behavior. One of the most chilling details comes years after the strike, when the next generation grows up, stunted, broken, and unable to rebuild. Hope itself becomes a casualty. Audiences in the UK were shaken. Some reportedly fainted while watching, while others admitted they couldn't sleep for days. Critics called it the bleakest film ever shown on television, and even hardened viewers said it was almost too much to handle. To this day, Threads is often used in classrooms not as entertainment, but as a warning. If The Day After rattled America, Threads devastated Britain, and decades later, it remains a benchmark for how far television can go in showing the unshowable. Defcon 4, 1984. Now, let's pivot to something grittier, more pulpy, but no less terrifying in its own way. Defcon 4, released in 1984, takes a slightly different approach. Instead of showing the moment of global disaster, it drops viewers into the aftermath through the eyes of 3 astronauts returning to Earth after strikes have turned their planet into a nightmare. The premise itself is chilling. Imagine being safe in orbit watching chaos unfold below, and then being forced to return to a world that no longer resembles the one you left. Once the astronauts land, survival becomes the only goal. They find themselves facing not just devastation, but also the darker side of human nature. Society has collapsed, and what's left is a brutal landscape where power is held by those ruthless enough to seize it. Unlike the grim realism of Threads or the intimate heartbreak of Testament Defcon, 4 leans into exploitation cinema, with gritty visuals, shocking violence, and a constant sense of dread. But don't let that fool you. Its imagery struck audiences because it felt like the kind of chaos that could erupt when order vanishes. The film is part sci-fi, part horror, and part survival story, and it thrives on its claustrophobic atmosphere. Critics were divided, some calling it sensational, others praising its raw nerve. But for cult audiences, Defcon 4 became a staple of post-apocalyptic cinema. Its low-budget edge actually makes it feel dirtier, scarier, and somehow more real. It's not polished, and that's exactly why it sticks with you. In the crowded field of nuclear war films, Defcon 4 carved out its own place, a reminder that the collapse of order is often just as terrifying as the event that triggered it. Countdown to Looking Glass, 1984. Few films have the nerve to blend fiction with news reporting, but Countdown to Looking Glass did just that and left viewers chilled. Released in 1984 as a made-for-TV movie in Canada, it plays out like a breaking news broadcast of a global crisis spiraling out of control. Instead of a traditional narrative, the story is framed through anchors, live updates, and special correspondence, giving it a realism that felt uncomfortably close to home. The plot begins with financial instability and global tensions, a chain reaction that slowly pushes the world toward the brink. What makes it so terrifying is how mundane it all feels. A reporter gives a live update, a political leader makes a speech, a government official reassures the public, all while the countdown toward disaster ticks quietly in the background. It doesn't come with explosions or dramatic music. It comes through the unsettling banality of a news ticker. Unlike theatrical releases, Countdown to Looking Glass used its pseudo-documentary style to blur the line between reality and fiction. Viewers in 1984, already living under Cold War tension, admitted that it felt like something that could actually air on television at any moment. The "you are there" perspective gave audiences no safe distance. They weren't watching characters in a movie theater. They were watching themselves as if the nightmare was unfolding right outside their windows. Critics had mixed reactions. Some dismissed it as TV sensationalism, while others praised its daring format. But the impact was undeniable. It brought the threat of global collapse into people's living rooms in the most literal way possible. If The Day After made you feel the blast, Countdown to Looking Glass made you feel the dread of watching disaster unfold one news update at a time. That's why decades later, it's still remembered as one of the boldest experiments in nuclear war storytelling. When the Wind Blows, 1986. Animation isn't supposed to be this haunting. But When the Wind Blows, released in 1986, shattered expectations by using a gentle, almost childlike medium to deliver one of the bleakest depictions of nuclear fallout ever put on screen. Adapted from Raymond Briggs's illustrated novel, the film tells the story of an elderly British couple, Jim and Hilda, who naively trust government pamphlets and routines as their world crumbles around them. At first, the animation style feels comforting, soft lines, warm colors, and an almost storybook quality. But that innocence is exactly what makes the devastation hit harder. When disaster strikes, the couple clings to hope, boiling water, sealing windows, and following instructions that are tragically useless. Their optimism is heartbreaking. And as the days drag on, the viewers witness their decline in a way that feels both tender and devastating. The film uses a powerful contrast. Whimsical visuals paired with grim realism. Pink Floyd's Roger Waters even contributed to the soundtrack, adding a haunting atmosphere that lingers long after the credits roll. Audiences expecting an animated fable were blindsided. Instead of comfort, they were handed despair wrapped in pastel colors. Critics praised When the Wind Blows for daring to use animation in such a mature and uncompromising way. It became a cultural talking point, proving that cartoons could be just as powerful, sometimes even more powerful, than live action when dealing with terrifying subject matter. Watching Jim and Hilda's quiet deterioration is like witnessing a nightmare painted in watercolor. For many, this film was more devastating than anything with explosions and special effects. It made viewers weep, and it reminded them that behind every statistic are ordinary people clinging to hope until the very end. Miracle Mile, 1988. Sometimes the scariest stories don't show you the world ending. They show you the minutes leading up to it. Miracle Mile, released in 1988, is one of the greatest ticking clock thrillers ever made. Set in Los Angeles, it follows a man who accidentally overhears a phone call warning that strikes are incoming. He has only 70 minutes to decide what to do and who to save. Anthony Edwards stars as Harry, an ordinary guy who suddenly finds himself holding a secret too big to process. The movie unfolds in real time, a frantic race through the neon-lit streets of LA as he scrambles to find his girlfriend warn strangers and figure out whether the call was real or just a cruel prank. That uncertainty is the film's masterstroke. Is disaster really coming? Or is paranoia driving everyone into chaos? The atmosphere is electric. Diners, buses, police cars, and random bystanders all get swept into Harry's desperate mission. Each scene ratchets up the tension, and the city itself becomes a character, a labyrinth of flashing signs and frantic crowds, all unaware of what might be seconds away. The score, pulsing with urgency, drives home the feeling that time is slipping through your fingers. What makes Miracle Mile terrifying is its intimacy. It's not about leaders or generals. It's about one man and the people he loves. Audiences walked away shaken because it asked a question no one wants to answer. If you had just over an hour before the world changed forever, what would you do? Though not a blockbuster, the film became a cult favorite praised for its originality and nerve-shredding suspense. It's part romance, part thriller, part nightmare, and every bit unforgettable. Miracle Mile doesn't just terrify you with images of destruction. It terrifies you with the choices you might make if you believed the clock was almost out. By Dawn's Early Light, 1990. Made for HBO but shot with the intensity of a theatrical thriller. By Dawn's Early Light from 1990 is a hidden gem in the nuclear war genre. While films like Fail Safe and Dr. Strangelove had already explored accidents and miscalculations, this one cranked up the suspense by putting viewers inside the cockpit, the command centers, and the highest levels of government all at once. The plot begins when a rogue Soviet faction launches an unauthorized strike hoping to provoke chaos and blame it on the United States. Suddenly, both nations are locked in a terrifying chain reaction. The movie unfolds like a nightmare version of chess where every move could trigger the endgame. James Earl Jones, Rebecca De Mornay, and Powers Booth give gripping performances balancing the human side of fear with the cold weight of military responsibility. What makes By Dawn's Early Light stand out is its pacing. It doesn't drag viewers into long political speeches. Instead, it dives headfirst into the chaos, alternating between pilots in the sky, wrestling with impossible orders, and leaders on the ground, scrambling to prevent total collapse. The scenes inside the bomber jets are claustrophobic, filled with sweat-blinking lights and the ticking dread of incoming commands. Critics praised it for bringing blockbuster tension to television, and audiences were impressed by how real it all felt. HBO was still finding its footing as a destination for edgy prestige storytelling, and this film proved it could deliver just as much punch as the big screen. It's a nail-biter that captures the insane fragility of global safety and the razor-thin line between peace and chaos. For many, it remains one of the most underappreciated gems in this entire genre. The Last Island, 1990. If most nuclear war movies show the immediate blast or the structured collapse of society, The Last Island, released in 1990, takes a different approach. It's about the aftermath, not just physical devastation, but what happens when a small group of survivors is left to wrestle with human nature itself. Set on a remote island, the film strips the genre down to its bare bones. There are no generals, no governments, and no sprawling cities reduced to rubble. Instead, it's about people trapped together, trying to build a fragile community, while haunted by the knowledge that the rest of the world is gone. At first, there's hope. Survivors cooperate, share resources, and cling to the idea that maybe they can rebuild. But as always, pressure cracks the mask of civility. Power struggles emerge, selfishness takes root, and fear turns friends into rivals. What terrified audiences wasn't giant explosions or political intrigue, it was the raw psychology of collapse. Watching ordinary people unravel without the structure of society is more disturbing than any special effect. The film's isolation amplifies the horror. With no outside help, no governments, left and no safe haven to run to the island becomes a microcosm of humanity's struggle to survive itself. Though less famous than titles like Threads or The Day After, The Last Island deserves credit for exploring the quieter, more personal horror of post-apocalyptic life. It asks a question scarier than any mushroom cloud. If the world ended tomorrow, could human beings really cooperate, or would they destroy each other before anything else finished the job? Blast from the Past, 1999. Now for something very different. Blast from the Past, released in 1999, isn't grim, raw, or horrifying like the others on this list. In fact, It's a romantic comedy, but don't let its lighter tone fool you. Its entire premise is built on the paranoia of the nuclear age, and it uses humor to explore just how much fear shaped an entire generation. The story follows a quirky couple who convince the world is about to end retreat into a fallout shelter in the early 1960s. They raise their son underground, shielded from the chaos they believe has consumed the outside world. Decades later, he emerges into the 90s utterly unprepared for modern life. Brendan Fraser's wide-eyed innocence as the sheltered son, alongside Alicia Silverstone's street-smart character, makes for plenty of laughs. But beneath the comedy lies an undeniable truth. Fear of collapse changed how people lived, loved, and prepared for the future. Unlike the devastating realism of Threads or the heart-wrenching sorrow of Testament, this film chooses levity. But that contrast is what makes it valuable. It reminds viewers that during the Cold War, the fear of global catastrophe seeped into every corner of culture, even romantic comedies. And while Blast from the Past won't leave you sleepless, it still carries a faint echo of unease. Because beneath the charming dance numbers and quirky misunderstandings, there's always the shadow of why that family went underground in the first place. It may not terrify like the other entries, but it deserves a spot here for showing how even humor was shaped by the fear of the unthinkable. Sometimes laughter is just another way of coping with dread. The Sum of All Fears, 2002. Ending this list with a modern thriller makes perfect sense, and The Sum of All Fears delivers. Released in 2002, this adaptation of Tom Clancy's novel showed a nightmare scenario that audiences found all too believable. A lost device hidden for decades is discovered and detonated at a major sporting event. The result isn't flashy fiction. It's a chilling reminder of how fragile global safety can feel. Ben Affleck stars as a young Jack Ryan, with Morgan Freeman playing his mentor. Their mission is to trace the source of the strike and stop a chain reaction of retaliation that could spiral out of control. The movie is packed with tension, but what shocked audiences most was its realism. Unlike the more abstract fears of the Cold War, this film tapped into 21st century anxieties about hidden dangers and sudden catastrophe in everyday life. The stadium sequence where an unsuspecting crowd becomes the target is one of the most unforgettable moments in the genre. Instead of distant mushroom clouds, it shows devastation in the middle of ordinary life, making the horror immediate and personal. Viewers walked away shaken, not because of spectacle, but because it all felt terrifyingly plausible. Critics gave mixed reviews on its blockbuster elements, but even skeptics admitted it captured a new kind of fear. The Cold War may have ended, but dread remained, and The Sum of All Fears proved that these stories still resonate in a world where the stakes haven't gone away. Ending the list here ties the genre's long history to the present, showing how audiences remain haunted by the same old question: what happens if the unthinkable actually happens? So, there you have it. 15 films that didn't just entertain, but left audiences shaken silent or laughing nervously in the dark. From the bleak realism of Threads to the satirical bite of Dr. Strangelove and the raw suspense of Miracle Mile, each one tapped into a universal fear. What if the world ended not tomorrow, but today? Which of these films scarred you the most, or did we miss one that still keeps you up at night? Tell us in the comments, hit subscribe, and let's keep this conversation alive.